Hello! So, following my review of the Hollyland Mars 4K, Hollyland actually reached out again and asked if I wanted to take a look at their new combination monitor transceiver, the Hollyland Mars M1. So, I have to say, as a camera assistant, I love the idea of having an operating monitor and transmitter built into one unit. The promise of taking another box off the camera and just simplifying the camera builds is something I'm always looking to do. Now, on camera builds, I traditionally put on an operating monitor, a teradek for zero delay image transmission, as well as an MDR or a motor drive unit for the wireless follow focus system. As you can imagine, sometimes those builds get pretty complex. So I was pretty excited to get this product and see if it lived up to the hype. So first, let's jump into the build quality. This is definitely not one of your cheap plastic monitors. Although it is plastic, it has a nice rubberized coating around the side. It's heavy enough to feel dense and sturdy, while at the same time being lightweight enough to not completely throw off a camera build's balance. So although the antennas don't have to be removed when you're packing things up, they actually can still come off, so if you want to put on longer antennas that can get you a greater range, you can totally do so. I do want to mention that the Mars M1 also has active cooling, which kind of makes sense because usually receivers, transmitters, they tend to get pretty hot, and then monitors as well, they also tend to get pretty hot. So it's good to see that they have a fan in here. They do have a mute mode for it, which kind of puts it into a lower RPM mode. Unfortunately, I can't currently test it in the hot Texas sun, as obviously it's winter, but I haven't had any overheating issues in any kind of studio environments. I will also give a tip as somebody who often works out in the hot Texas sun. If you ever have dark devices that are starting to overheat in the sun, you can actually cover them in white tape, and the white tape will actually kind of passively cool them down. It's kind of a weird science trick, and it ends up reflecting most of the heat away from the device. As I said earlier, doing a lot of jobs in the Texas heat, you'll pick up a few tricks like that. Now let's jump into the device's performance and overall latency test. But before we do, if you have time and enjoyed the video, a like is, as always, very much appreciated. If you want to see more like this, a subscription is also very much appreciated. But if not, that dislike button works extra well if you hit it twice. Now, taking a look at the I/O of the device, the monitor has an NPF battery plate on the back, which is obviously currently being used, as well as a barrel connector in for DC power. Now, luckily enough, Hollyland actually now includes DTAP cables with the barrel connector at the end, which I am such a fan of seeing. I think these should be included with every camera accessory that needs power, and is a cable I will often use on professional camera builds. I will say there is one slight downside. This is not a locking barrel connector, and actually there is no ability to use a locking barrel connector with this, well, at least the locking functionality, because there are no threads for the lock to go into. So unfortunately for this type of device, monitors, I usually really do like to see either a 2-pin LEMO connector or a locking barrel connector, because this kind of device is the thing that you're going to be moving around on the camera rig, and with not too much effort, this kind of plug can come undone. But you can't win them all, and I'm just happy to see that they've included the DTAP at all. Above the bottom DC barrel in, you have a DC barrel out, and I will say, as somebody who's done hundreds of camera builds, I've never actually found this DC barrel out to be helpful at all for any kind of builds. So I think this is definitely a port that they could probably get rid of. I'm sure there's somebody out there that uses it, but for any of my purposes, I have never found it actually useful. So on the side of the device, we have a USB-C port, which is helpful for either loading LUTs on or loading new firmware onto the device. Going to the opposite side of the device, we have two HDMI ports, one HDMI in and one HDMI out. I will say that I really like to see that they have an HDMI out port, as that means that this is not going to be the end of a signal chain. So basically, if your camera only has one output for video, which a lot of lower end models do, then you can go into HDMI here and then come out, and if you need to go to another transmitter, say a zero delay teradek, then you can do that without an issue. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the SDI port on the back. This is only a 3G SDI, and it does not have an SDI out. So that means this will be the end of a signal chain for SDI. So for example, on an FX6, you only have one SDI out port, and so that would, if you had a zero delay transmitter such as a teradek, you would have to go into the teradek, out of the teradek, and into the M1, which isn't the most ideal, but it doesn't add too much latency. It's just not my favorite, and I would just like to see this have an SDI out, as that adds a lot of versatility. Swinging back to the side and discussing the HDMI ports once again, I will say that I really don't like the position of these HDMI ports being on the side. I know that there are a good amount of competitors that like to put the HDMI ports on the side of the monitor, but I will say that one, it doesn't make for a very clean build, and two, it also makes for the cables to kind of stick out and be very, very easy to damage. Now let's come back around to the screen where we'll talk about the user interface. Overall, I have to say I don't have a lot of complaints when it comes to this user interface. On the bottom, you have a hotbar with a lot of quick functions. We have histograms, LUTs, focus peaking, as well as vector scopes, which is kind of interesting, zebras, and quite a few other functions. Interestingly enough, they also have the monitor color temperature on here for some reason. I'm not really sure why that's on the hotbar. That should definitely just be in the display settings, but I guess if you need to hit it really fast, maybe. Another thing of note, unfortunately for these zebras, they only have one selector, so you can't actually just select a region. So for example, a lot of people use zebras to kind of isolate skin tones and then make sure that these skin tones are being exposed properly, so kind of around 70%. So unfortunately, I can't really do that without just like selecting half of it. One point of interest I'd like to talk about is the display settings. This currently comes from the factory calibrated, which is great. However, I really would like to see the ability to customize the color on the screen, as over time calibrations do shift. That's just a universal thing on every monitor. Continuing on to the functionality of this monitor transceiver combo, you can actually send or receive wireless video on this device. It just depends on what mode it's in. Now, as a transmitter, it can actually connect to either 2 Hollyland receivers or 2 M1 displays, or 4 mobile devices. So each receiver you connect up takes 2 mobile device spots for a total of 4 mobile device spots. Adding on, there actually is a brand new feature when it comes to the Hollyland Mars M1, and that is the ability to record up to 3 minutes internally of video on this device. Unfortunately, you can't take it off the device, and unfortunately, it also does disappear when the device turns off. So it is just stored in volatile memory and is gone once the device goes off. So something to consider, but kind of a cool feature regardless. Now, let's get into what you actually came here for. How does this device perform, and what is the latency on this device? Like the Mars 4K system, this has a really good range of 450 feet and keeps the image quality pretty solid through most of that. Now, in regards to latency, Hollyland actually reports that they have an 80 millisecond delay on this transmitter, which means it's not going to be ideal for something like focus pulling or even remote operation. That being said, there are plenty of use cases where this is totally fine and acceptable. However, in our findings, we did find that there was anywhere from 80 to over 200 milliseconds of lag. These tests were done in 1080p, so this should have been kind of ideal conditions for a 4K device. I also found one more oddity when testing the latency of this device, and that's that it has quite a bit of latency even when just hardwired into the device. So that is just purely camera straight to screen via HDMI or SDI. I tested this on both a Blackmagic camera through HDMI as well as an FX6 via SDI, kind of thinking, oh, maybe this is just an HDMI issue, and unfortunately it's not. Unfortunately, it kind of spreads to both. In my testing, the Mars M1 actually had 20 to 50 milliseconds more input latency than just a standard small HD 702 bright. I think this is kind of the crux or the main issue of the Mars M1. The direct input lag is something that's kind of strange, and I don't know, hopefully it's just a software issue that they can update, and if that's the case, I will absolutely let you guys know down below. Perhaps I just have a buggy unit. So finally, let's get to the ultimate goal of the product. The promise of a transmitter, a receiver, and a monitor all in one product is something that I find very exciting. Just the ability alone to use this as either an operating monitor with a built-in transmitter or a director's monitor with a built-in receiver are two very nice to have options. I do have to say though, with the current input lag on the video inputs on this monitor, I don't know that camera operating is the most optimized task for it. The latency does have a potential to hinder the response times of a camera operator, which is why I'm kind of putting a slight warning by that use case. So I still do think there's a pretty sizable market that would take advantage of this kind of device. So what would be some of those use cases? If you don't need a zero delay system, so for example, if you're using autofocus or pulling focus on the camera itself, that could be totally okay, and this type of system would potentially work really well for you. I think this paired with a Mars 4K transmitter would be really great, as this is a nice compact package that you can just hand off and let somebody watch what you're doing. I even think this device could be useful on mid-sized productions as kind of a complementary device. So I think if you had the Mars 4K transmitter on the camera along with a Teradek, so for example, you'd use the Teradek as kind of a feed for the first AC to be pulling focus, and then you would use the Mars 4K as kind of a way to give a good amount of people different screens, whether they be mobile or the Mars M1 unit. Now, I did actually test out the Teradek 4K 750 LT in combination with the Mars 4K transmitter to see kind of if they would have any interference with each other. And I did kind of find that there was some interference when you put the devices very close to each other. So I think the best course of action is to separate them apart a little bit, as well as select channels that don't interfere with each other. Now, don't get me wrong, throughout this whole video, I do still find the Mars M1 to be a pretty compelling package. However, it is something that I want to see some improvements from Hollyland on, both on the software and hardware side. Most importantly, I want to see the direct hardwired input lag come down pretty drastically. I think once Hollyland gets it down, whether through software updates or a hardware revision, this will be a hard display to compete with for the price. But as for right now, I look forward to seeing future firmware updates and what they can add to this device, as well as future hardware revisions as they hopefully get that input lag down. As far as conclusions go, they're pretty similar to my Mars 4K transmission system review, and that is for the correct person with the correct expectations. I think this could be a solid addition to a production's workflow and kind of democratizes the ability of other crew members and departments to have multiple screens on set. I very much look forward to where Hollyland is going in the future and where they continue to grow and improve. Now, if you have any questions, let me know down below or hit me up on Instagram, as I'm much more likely to respond quickly there. As always, I hope you learned something, or at the very least saw a cool gadget. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.